So today we're going to talk a little bit about how consumers learn and how memories are formed and then accessed by consumers in their everyday lives. So first, let's start talking about how the memory actually and learning happens in consumers. And for that, we're going to talk about some of the theories that discuss how consumers actually learn. And we're going to talk about different types of learning, and in particular, we're going to start with conditioning, which is this idea of pairing things. Human beings are phenomenal in many ways, but one of the ways that we are particularly interested in is that we actually find patterns in nature and in things that we are exposed to, and we actually learn from them. And this pairing of patterns and consequences is what really generates learning. We're going to talk about some examples and some theories that explain this in a moment. Okay. Now, first, maybe we should clarify what do we mean by learning. From a psychology perspective and from a consumer behavior perspective, which is what we're trying to learn about. Learning is basically mostly about a change in behavior, right? So we're talking about learning as something that affects the way we actually behave. Or the way we actually go about doing things, okay? And this change should be somewhat permanent, okay? Not something that just happens momentarily, but it actually repeats over time, okay? Now, the interesting thing about learning is that it's happening constantly and all the time. And because of this, sometimes we encounter situations where we are actually even learning when we're not trying to learn, right? So right now you're sitting in front of the computer, hopefully trying to learn something about, in this case, memory, right? And learning. But in general, even when you are actually not actively trying to learn, you might find out new patterns that you did not notice before. And we call this incidental learning. This is something that it's happened without you actively or without explicit motivation from the subject. So you're really not trying to learn, but you learn anyway. And the reason why is because we are looking for these patterns, either consciously or subconsciously as human beings. We're going to talk about how this works in a minute. So we're going to make a broad distinction between two different types of learning. One is we're going to talk about behavioral learning theories, right? And this is going to be theories that explain these patterns of pairing of stimuli and responses, mostly, okay? And then we're going to talk a little bit about cognitive theories, which is basically looking as consumers are problem solvers. So these tend to be associated with a little bit more complex learning tasks than behavioral learning theories, but they both build in very similar patterns, even though the mechanisms are actually different. So let's start with behavioral learning theories first. Okay, so first let's discuss different types of behavioral learning theories. The first one is classical conditioning. I'm assuming you already know a little bit about this, maybe because I don't know, you've taken another class, or maybe because you've seen somebody talk about it. But classical conditioning is the fact that when you pair two stimuli, two things, we just make associations automatically. And by we, not only humans, but also animals do, right? This is how you can train your dog, for example, at least one of the ways. There are different ways, but this is one of the ways, right? So that's classical conditioning. I'm going to explain these effects a little bit more in detail, but the gist of it is when you have two things that happen simultaneously, we just build an association, and because of that, when we find any of the two, we expect the other one to happen, okay? So for example, when you hear thunder, right, because usually it comes together with rain, you expect to get wet if you are on the street, right? So if you hear thunder, you expect rain to come. Now, sometimes this might not pair, but for the most part it doesn't, because of that, when we hear one of the stimulus, the other one is actually triggered for us, right? That's classical conditioning. I will describe it in more detail in the following slide. Okay. The other one is instrumental conditioning, also known as operant conditioning. And it's a different type of learning. And the idea here is not just because two things happen together. The idea here is because we display a certain behavior, we get a certain consequence. It could be either positive or negative consequence. And this reward system or punishment system, it depends, is what takes us to the point of changing our behavior, right? And this is what you do maybe in school with things like grades, right? Where, if you do certain behaviors, you get certain rewards, right? And this is a different type of learning. It's not just because two things happen together, it's because the consequences are linked to the behavior. Okay, so we'll talk about these two types of theories a little bit more in detail. So first, let's start talking about classical conditioning. The classical example of classical conditioning, it's Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov was a researcher, a scientist that was studying how animals learn. And most of these learning principles actually apply to humans as well. We are, to some degree, animals after all, right? So the idea is simple. You have different types of stimuli that we are exposed to. Some of them trigger responses in animals and humans, regardless, right? Even if we haven't learned anything. What do I mean by this? For example, loud noises, right? Even if you're just a newborn, right? So you have learned nothing, right? Because, let's just say you have not been exposed to the world, and because of that, you don't know anything. A really loud noise will trigger fear in babies, okay? And the reason why it happens is because this is an instinctual behavior. So this is what we call an unconditioned stimulus. It's a stimulus that creates a response without any learning, okay? The same thing happens with food, right? When you smell food, right, it tends to make you maybe think about eating, and also even subconsciously, your body reacts to the smell by generating more saliva. Okay, and this is exactly the effect that Pavlov studied with the famous Pavlov dogs. Okay, so you have an unconditioned stimulus, which in the case of the Pavlov dogs, it was some meat powder, right? You can think of it as kibble, although apparently it didn't have little shapes. It was more of a powdery substance, but it's the same thing, really. Okay, and that's the unconditioned stimulus. Why do we call it unconditioned stimulus? Because it generates a response. In this case, the response is going to be salivation of the dogs, right? The scientists will measure the amount of saliva that actually is generated by the dogs, right? And that response happens regardless. There is no learning that is built in. It's part of the natural reaction of the body, right? And then we have a conditioned stimulus. This is some sort of neutral stimulus that has nothing to do with any of the biological responses of the dogs. And the typical example used was a bell, right? If you have a bell that doesn't have a really loud sound, right, that will, maybe annoy the dog, but, a bell that is something that in principle is not related to any of the biological makeup of the dog. And we call that a conditioned stimulus. And the reason why is because it can be used when paired with an unconditional stimulus to learn. Okay, and the way this works in the classical example is every time that the food is brought to the dogs that are hungry, what they will do is they will ring a bell, right? The ringing of the bell is the conditioned stimulus. The unconditional stimulus is the actual food, right? And what will happen with the dogs after, a few pairings, after a few times where the bell is rung and then the food is presented to the dogs, is that if you do not show the food to the dog and you just ring the bell, the dog will start salivating, right? And the reason why this happens is because the dog has learned that every time that the bell is rung, there is food on the table or on the plate. Okay, maybe not the table. I guess it depends how you train your dogs, right? So this pairing of the stimuli is what creates the learning. So it's a very simple behavior, right? We're not learning theoretical physics here, right? But the fact that two things happen simultaneously, it makes us learn that when one shows up, the other one is likely to show up, right? And because of that, we're just learning, right? It's this pattern recognition. And by the way, this has been proved to work very well with, all sort of animals, mice, monkeys, birds, right? Dogs, obviously, right? Like I was alluding to before. Now, we know this effect of the pairing, which we call classical conditioning, becomes stronger the more times that pairing is shown, right? What do I mean by that? If you only show the dog the bell one time and the food one time, that might not actually necessarily trigger in all cases learning. But if you show it 2, 3, 4, 5 times, especially at 5, it's a lot more likely to occur than it is at 2. Okay, so the number of repetitions that those two stimuli actually are together tends to make the relationship stronger. Okay, so the more, the more. Okay, the more you learn, the more times it actually happens, right? Okay. And then there are a couple of other issues. One is stimulus generalization, which is that the dog, and by the way, when I say dog, you can substitute for human. The dog will maybe after the bell has been rung enough times and that learning has happened, might actually confuse or generalize the stimulus to something that sounds similar to a bell. For example, if you have some keys in your hand and you jingle those keys, right, and they might make a sound that is somewhat similar to the bell. Of course, it depends the kind of bell you have, right, and the kind of keys. But if they do have a similar sound, the dog might generalize the stimulus from the bell to the keys jingling, and it might elicit the same response. So it might salivate when you hear the keys as well. Okay, but humans are very good at generalizing, more so than dogs and other animals. In fact, the capacity of abstraction, which is generalization, is abstracting an idea, right? It's one of the things that differentiates humans from animals. We do a great job at this. This is how a lot of the higher level learning that happens in humans actually is created. Stimulus discrimination is the opposite of generalization. It's when the stimulus is not shown all the time together. It might actually make the relationship go away. So if not every time you ring the bell, you actually bring the food, especially if that happens pretty randomly, let's say 50% of the time, and then it might actually create this effect of discrimination, which eventually will lead to extinction. Extinction is when the relationship between the two stimuli pairing together disappears, right? It goes away. Yeah, so if they don't occur enough times together, the relationship might actually go away, right? Because you're confusing the audience in a way, right? Confusing the dog. Okay. A few more points on the same idea, right? The nature of the stimulus matters, right? So when the stimulus is easy to identify and paired together and it shows up and it's repeated multiple times, you're going to learn the effect, right? When it generalizes to other stimuli that are similar, we call that halo effect. At least it's one of the generalization principles. So you might hear about this. If somebody tells you about a halo effect, they are talking about this generalization of stimuli. For example, in the case of a marketer, the shape of the product, for example, if there is a product that is popular, what might happen is that, people will tend to assume that other products that look alike will also be popular, right? And they will work well. So, for example, you have here phone shape, right? And beyond the technical details of why forms are picked. So if you're a technical guy, you will tell me the reason why the form is like this is because the human hand is a certain size, and because of that, this is going to be more ergonomic, yalla, 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 yalla. But another reason why is this halo effect, right? Is because if the iPhone, it's a good phone, anything else that looks similar to the iPhone should also be a good phone. So you can leverage on this halo effect to attain a positive reaction from consumers beyond what the technical requirements of the phone actually are, right? I've already talked about stimulus discrimination. And then one classic application of this conditioning principle that we've been discussing so far and learning is brand equity, right? The fact that one of the facts that explain why companies spend so heavily on brands is this idea that because every time you see the brand is associated with maybe a positive experience, and what you're doing as a consumer is you are learning by just pure conditioning principle that a certain brand is good, right? Here you have in the slide some of the top brands as measured by brand equity, which is how much the brand is worth. And of course, it's an accounting figure, so we don't know exactly how much brands are worth, but we know they're worth a lot. And the reason why is because of this. When people see the brand, they associate that with the positive experiences that they have had in the past. And it's this strong conditioning effect that makes brands valuable, right? So brands, what they do is they, for example, reduce uncertainty for consumers. What do I mean by this? Well, if you know that, I don't know, for example, you have here Xbox, right, by Microsoft. So if you know that in the past you had an Xbox One, for example, and now Microsoft is going to launch a new console, right? Just because it has the Xbox brand associated with it, and in the past you have had positive experiences, you're going to be more likely to buy that than, let's say, maybe a PlayStation 5. And the only reason why is because maybe you've never played the Sony product before, right? So this is the idea behind brand equity, and this is the reason, one of the reasons why so many companies spend so heavily on brands. You're talking about billions of dollars, right? I already talked about how repetition works from the pure mechanistic perspective, but it's not as simple as the more the better. Right? It is true that there is a minimum number of exposures that are required for you to learn, right? So if those stimulus are paired, like in the case of the dog and the food, only one or two times you might not find the pattern. Because of that, you don't learn, or you might not notice the pattern. The same thing applies to advertising, for example, right? We're bombarded with all these ads. If we only see an ad one time, especially if we're not paying much attention, which is the way it happens for many consumers, we might not learn, we might not even know who the ad is for, etc. But if we see it multiple times, that's going to build that learning. So you're going to maybe get some of the points of the ad or create some of the associations. So for example, there's a beautiful model, whether male or female, I don't care, right? Associated with the product. So the product's shown, the beautiful model is shown. You're making that association that I was talking about, right? If it happens multiple times, you're going to build that learning, right? But there is a threshold where you start doing the opposite, right? What happens is you cannot get bored, right? So if you see the same ad one or two times, you might start building a pattern maybe after the third time, right? You start learning about whatever the ad is about, like I was showing simple images or text or whatever it is, right? On the other hand, if you see the same ad 15 times, right, maybe after the 10th time, you start getting tired of the ad, right? And so there is this idea of advertising wear out, right? So there are diminishing marginal returns to exposure. That's number one. So, you learn a lot more in the first few times you see the ad than, later. Plus, eventually there is a bother effect, right? It's like, you've seen it so many times that now when you see it, it actually annoys you just because you already seen it so many times, right? And to avoid this, what you will see a lot of companies do is what you can see here in the diagram, which is that instead of launching a campaign with the same ad all the time, what they will do is they will just have, periods of time, right, where they will show the same ad, and then maybe with a similar concept but a different implementation of that concept, they will launch a new ad, right? And the reason why you do this is because otherwise, there are two reasons. One is, if you remember about perception, unless a stimulus is novel enough, we don't pay attention to it, right? That's number one. But number two, there is this wear out effect, right? So to avoid the wear out, what you will do is you will slightly, or maybe not so slightly, change the advertising campaign over periods of time. And what is the appropriate length of time? It really depends on the product, complexity of the ad, etc. But here you have an example where the company is changing their advertising campaign every 4 weeks. And the reason why you do this is because otherwise people get bored, which is not surprising, I think. So there is a balance between learning. So if you don't put it enough times, if you don't repeat it multiple times, you don't learn. On the other hand, if you repeat it too many times, it becomes ineffective, and it can actually have deleterious effects, means negative effects. Right? Another thing that we can take from this learning theory in terms of uh, marketing strategy suggestions is what can we do with stimulus generalization. This is something that is subconsciously happening all the time, right? You're abstracting things, you don't even notice. This is something you do as a human being, right? So you can actually leverage this effect, for example, if you're launching new products, by creating line extensions, right? What is a product line? I'm assuming you know. It's a group of products or services that are highly related to each other. So here you have an example of a product line, right? So you have vitamin water, but it's not just one type of vitamin water, you have multiple types, right? So this will be a line, product line. And a line extension is when you launch a new instance of the product by leveraging the fact that people are going to generalize their thinking about the product. And so this stimulus generalization is going to help you launch new products successfully, right? Because they already liked your old products in the past. New products that are similar are going to generalize whatever benefits you were conveying to customers. They're going to just work, right? Good. Same thing happens with whole services. So the idea of franchising is very, very successful, for example, at restaurants. And the reason why is because if you've been in one McDonald's, you know, whatever you learn from that McDonald's is going to leverage to other franchises launched by that company, right? So you can apply this to services, and, you know, your competitors can also apply this to you, right? And this is why you have so many product packages that look so close together, right? So here you have a national brand, Heads and Shoulders, right? That it's well known for dandruff treatment, right? On the other hand, you have here a store brand that looks pretty close together. I mean, pretty close, pretty similar, right? So if you don't know anything about shampoo and you look at both of these bottles and you see that one is priced at $3 and the other one is at $1.50, you start thinking, well, if they are so similar, and maybe even if they have the same active ingredient, which you can check in the back and they actually do, you start thinking that whatever benefits you were getting with the national brand, that it's more expensive, you might also be able to get with your store brand. So maybe a good reason to actually try it. This is why if you look at supermarket aisles, a lot of the products have very similar designs and color patterns. It's because consumers learn about them and they are likely to purchase those products because they associate whatever benefits they have learned from the core brands to maybe some either new brands or store brands that maybe don't have as much experience with and or advertising budget. Okay, so we've been talking so far about classical conditioning, and I want to talk about a different learning theory that talks about how you actually do learning when it's a little bit more active, actively motivated by the consumer. So before we were learning just because we have two things show up together and we're just looking at patterns, and because of that we learn. Instrumental conditioning is a type of learning theory that discusses how we learn when there are rewards involved. And when I say rewards, I also mean punishments, right? So the idea here is our actions have certain responses or consequences, if you want to think about them like that, right? And based on those responses, we're going to basically modify our behavior to achieve the goal that we're interested in, right? And there are different types of responses that we can have, right? And you might be trying to achieve a goal that it's something that you're trying to get, or it could be something that you're trying to avoid, right? So it could be their positive reinforcement, which is basically when you do the same behaviors that are getting you the response that you're interested in, or the opposite, right? Negative reinforcement is when you're trying to limit a certain behavior and the negative consequences that come associated with it. Okay. This applies to many things for consumers, right? But this is something that is happening all the time. In fact, you can think about the type of learning that you usually do in a classroom as being at least one type of instrumental conditioning, right? Because the way it works is, you're trying to learn because learning is good for you, But because for the most part, or for most of us, looking really long term is hard, right? We usually need rewards that are more short term for us to actually do the learning, right? And the way learning works in a classroom setting oftentimes is that it's directly tied to grades, right? So grades are the rewards that are used in this learning context so that you will actually do the behaviors that the professor, in this case me, wants you to do. That could be things like reading the material, or maybe memorizing the material, etc., right? So this idea of instrumental conditioning, as you can imagine, it applies to consumers a lot also, right? Because consumers actively look for information to solve problems, right? So if you're hungry, what you're going to do, especially if you're in a new city where you've never been before, is now you're going to actively engage in learning strategies to try to solve your problem, right? In this case, problem being hungry. But of course, when I'm saying being hungry, anything else, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to actively look for information. You have smartphones, right? You might ask around, you might drive around and look for suitable candidates or restaurants, and then based on the response you get, like let's say you stop by an Arby's, right, and you grab, I don't know what's an Arby's. I think I've only eaten there once, right? And the reason why I've only eaten there once is because the experience I had was not very positive, right? So I ordered something, I honestly don't remember what. This was probably 20 years ago. And given that I was not very impressed and that there are so many other restaurants available, that negative interaction that I had with the brand taught me not to go there again, right? That's a type of instrumental conditioning. Now let's talk about the different types of learning mechanisms under this framework.